Tonight's presentation is titled The Decision Point. And our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. Mike holds a Certified Flight Instructor Certificate, an A&P Mechanics Certificate with Inspection Authorization. He's an author for numerous aviation publications, including the EAA Sport Aviation magazine. Mike was the Maintenance Aviation Technician of the Year in 2008 with the FAA and is a member of the EAA. Mike, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
My pleasure, Tim. Good evening, everybody. As Tim said, the topic tonight is a subject that I call the decision point, and it has to do with how aircraft owners can or should participate in the decision making on the maintenance of their aircraft, and sort of a plan of attack to make sure that happens. As those of you who have attended my webinars before or read my articles in Sport Aviation, you know that I am basically a very strong proponent of aircraft owners keeping tight control over the maintenance of their aircraft and actively managing the mechanics and shops that they hire to work on their aircraft. In a word, I think when it comes to maintenance, aircraft owners need to be control freaks and need to be heavily involved in the decision-making process. That doesn't mean that they have to be wrench swingers, but it does mean that in order to have a satisfactory maintenance outcome, they need to be involved in the decision-making. And specifically, and this just sort of seems like common sense, aircraft owners should never authorize any shop or mechanic to do any work on their aircraft without fully understanding what work is being used and why it's being proposed and what it's going to cost and how long it's going to take. And so in particular, you need to, before you approve any work on the airplane, I think you need to be able to feel satisfied that you know the answer to these questions. Why is the shop recommending the work? Is it an issue that affects safe flight? If it's a certificated aircraft, is it an issue that affects airworthiness, which is a little bit different than safety of flight? Is it something that's required by regulation? What will it cost? And how long will it take? And unless you know the answer to all of those questions about any specific maintenance task, you shouldn't be approving the work. You need to have all that information in order to give informed consent, if you will, to the work on your aircraft. Now, annual inspections are a little bit more difficult than other maintenance situations, because when you put the airplane in for an annual, you really don't know what they're going to find during the inspection. So you don't have any way of anticipating at the beginning of the process how much time and what the cost will be to make the repairs that are recommended or required as a result of the discrepancies found during the annual inspection. And furthermore, when you do put the airplane for annual, typically the airplane is sitting in the shop for a week, sometimes 2 weeks, and most owners have neither the time or the inclination to go down to the shop for a week or two and hang around while the annual is progressing, so that they can participate in the decision making. So for an annual inspection, it's a little difficult for owners to stay in control. But it's really important because the annual is usually when the lion's share of the work on the airplane is done, and the majority of the annual maintenance budget is spent. And because of the nature of an annual, we're basically you're authorizing the shop to go on a fishing expedition to try to find out what's wrong with the airplane. You run the greatest risk of bad things happening: surprises, misunderstandings, ruffled feathers, aggravation, sticker shock, disputes, even litigation. Um, because unlike normal maintenance, where you take the airplane into the shop with a particular squawk or a particular request for preventive maintenance, maybe an oil change or something, the annual, you're taking the airplane into the shop and you don't know what they're going to come up with until they inspect the airplane. So there's lots of opportunity for surprises, sometimes unpleasant surprises. And when owners and shops get crosswise with one another, it's almost always in the context of an annual inspection. So what is an owner to do about this? Well, of course, there's really two options. One is to hang around the shop during the entire course of the annual ordeal, something that we normally refer to as an owner-assisted annual. And I'm a big fan of owner-assisted annuals. I think that every aircraft owner should go through that experience at least once, because it's a way not only to learn a tremendous amount about your airplane, but also to learn a tremendous amount about the whole maintenance process and kind of get to understand what the world looks like from the other side of the toolbox, because you're hanging around with the mechanics and seeing what their world is like. So it's a very useful thing to do, but frankly, most owners are not interested in doing owner-assisted annuals, at least on an every year basis. So the other option is to make sure that you get involved in the decision-making process at a strategic moment in time that I call the decision point. So what is the decision point? Well, to explain that, first we need to talk about how an annual inspection normally flows, what's involved in the whole process of the annual inspection, or what I tend to call the annual ordeal, because there's more to it than just an inspection. And typically it's an 8-step process. And just quickly going through it, the first step is usually to open up the airplane, or open up the aircraft, making it inspectable by removing inspection panels, cowlings, fairings, seats, carpets, floorboards, all of the stuff that is in the way of inspecting the aircraft. And so that's really the first step. And once the airplane has been opened up, the next step is to actually do the inspection part of the inspection. And the inspection of the aircraft actually includes both a physical inspection of the aircraft and also an inspection of the aircraft's paper trail. And depending on the condition of the aircraft's paper trail, sometimes it actually takes longer to inspect the logbooks than it does to inspect the aircraft. It shouldn't if the logbooks are in good order, but often we find that they're not. But the whole purpose of this exercise of inspecting the aircraft and its logbooks is to identify any discrepancies that affect safety, that involve non-compliance with various airworthiness requirements, such as airworthiness directives, airworthiness limitations, and any other discrepancies that look like they ought to be addressed before they get worse. Then after the inspection is complete, the result is a discrepancy list. The inspector, the IAA who's inspecting the aircraft, creates a discrepancy list, and for every discrepancy should include a recommendation for what maintenance work is needed to correct the discrepancy, and an estimate of the cost of parts, labor, and outside work, so that the owner knows what he is going to be on the hook for if he approves the recommended maintenance. The discrepancy list should clearly identify, and I'll illustrate this in a minute, but clearly should identify which of the discrepancies are airworthiness items that the IA feels must be corrected in order for the aircraft to be returned to service as airworthy, and which items are discretionary recommendations that could be deferred or declined if the owner so chooses. And in my experience, typical annual inspection, only 20 or 25% of the discrepancies that are written up are actual airworthiness discrepancies. The majority of them are discretionary items, things that the mechanic recommends doing, but should the owner decline to do it or to defer it to a later time, that wouldn't interfere with the ability of the inspector to sign off the aircraft as airworthy. So we need to clearly identify which discrepancies are must-dos and which discrepancies are nice-to-dos, if you will. After the discrepancy list is created, then the discrepancies are repaired. Presumably all the airworthiness items are repaired, and those discretionary repairs that the aircraft owner approves going ahead and doing. During most annuals, we also perform a bunch of preventive maintenance. We pull off the wheels and grease the wheel bearings and do an oil change and an oil filter change and lubricate all sorts of things and so on. Now, doing the preventive maintenance is not actually a requirement during an annual inspection, but because the annual is the time when the airplane is all opened up, it's usually a very convenient time to do this preventive maintenance. So traditionally, we do quite a bit of preventive maintenance in the course of the annual ordeal. And then once the repairs and the PM have been completed, the airplane gets closed back up again, reinstalling all of the stuff that we removed in order to make the aircraft inspectable. The inspector makes the required logbook entries in the aircraft maintenance records. The inspection itself and the approval or disapproval for return to service is made in accordance with FAR 4311, which is what defines how inspection maintenance entries must be made. And any repairs performed are logged in accordance with FAR 43.9, which talks about how to log things other than inspections, like repairs and preventive maintenance. If there are any major repairs or major alterations, STC items installed, so on, then FA Form 337s may have to be completed and sent into the FAA in Oklahoma City. But at any rate, all the paperwork has to get done, and finally the invoice is written up and presented to the owner. And hopefully, if the owner has been involved in good communication with the IA all along, the invoice won't contain too many surprises. So that's basically the sequence of events that occurs during an annual. And there's a point in this process that I call the decision point, which is the time that the aircraft owner needs to get heavily involved in the decision-making process. And the decision point occurs after the inspection part of the inspection has been completed and the discrepancies have all been written up with estimates, recommendations, and estimates. But before any repairs have been started and before any parts have been ordered and so on, this is the time when the diagnosis, if you will, of the aircraft has been completed and the therapy is about to start. And so it's the critical point in the process where the owner needs to get involved. So essentially, what the decision point concept means is that this annual ordeal, if you will, is broken down into three discrete phases. The first phase is the inspection phase, where the shop performs the actual inspection. Typically, the inspection is performed on an agreed-to flat rate basis, so that the owner knows up front what the inspection part of the inspection is going to cost. And the inspection culminates with the creation of what we call a work order, which includes the detailed discrepancy list of all of the discrepancies found during the inspection, and a set of specific repair recommendations and cost estimates for correcting those discrepancies. So that's phase one. It's performed at a fixed fee, and it culminates with a work order that is information rich. Then phase two is where the aircraft owner goes over the work order, reviews the discrepancy list and the cost estimates and so on, does any research, gets any questions that he has answered, and eventually gives the shop specific direction as to what repairs he wants done, what repairs he would like to decline or defer. And then in phase three, the shop proceeds to perform the repairs as the owner has authorized, and concludes that process with the preparation of the logbook entries and the invoice. So that phase two that I put in the dotted box, that's really occurs at the point in the process that I call the decision point. The key thing that makes the owner review and approval possible is a good work order. Nowadays, most of the shops we work with, unfortunately not all, but most, have a fairly decent computerized work order management system, so that when it comes time to get the owner's review and approval, they can press a button and out will print a nicely formatted work order with all the information that the owner needs to have in order to make his decisions. And then at the end of the process, a button is pressed again, and out comes an invoice, which really looks quite similar to the work order. Here's an example of a typical work order. This thing is 9 pages long for a particular annual inspection. There are actually 2 major software packages for doing this that the majority of the shops we work with tend to use. One is called IBIS, IBIS. The other is called Total FBO. And there are a smattering of other software packages around. Some shops have roll your own software. Some shops use Excel spreadsheets to do this. But these 2 packages that are called IBIS and Total FBO seem to do the nicest job, and they create very, very nice work orders that are easy for everybody to work with. This particular one, I think, was created with IBIS. Here's a close-up of some of the entries on the work order, just so you can see. The entries are all numbered so that there's an easy way to refer to them. You can simply talk about item 21. They include the discrepancy that was found, the corrective action that's being recommended, and detailed information about the cost of repair, both the hours of labor that are involved and any parts that are involved. that item 16 involves replacing a very, very expensive electrical component called the MCU, which weighs in at a little over $3,000. Nice airplane part price there. But and as you see, I've sort of circled it in red. Each of the items includes an explanation of the item's status. For example, item 16, the one in the middle, is an airworthiness issue. So that's code for the shop saying, if you don't do this repair with this $3,000 MCU, we're not going to be able to sign off the annual as airworthy. Item 21, on the other hand, which is a loose side panel, presumably interior part, is listed as a recommended item, saying, that we recommend you do this. It's only a quarter of an hour, so it's no big deal. But if you should say no to this, it's not going to interfere with our ability to sign off the annual as airworthy. It's more of a cosmetic item. The top one, item 13, is marked as customer declined, which basically means we already discussed this, and the aircraft owner said he didn't want to do it. In this case, it was 300-hour cleaning of the fuel injectors that the manufacturer recommends, and the owner declined to have the fuel injectors cleaned, which in my view is a very good decision. We don't like to let the shops clean fuel injectors unless there's some clear engine monitor indication that there may be a partially clogged fuel injector. Let's see. Oh, excuse me. Here's some more items from an IBIS work order, and again, you can see how they're numbered, and they're indicated as with the status: airworthiness item, recommended, airworthiness item, and so on. It's very important that the work order make it clear to the owner which items the shop considers required in order to make the aircraft airworthy, and which items are not required but are just recommended. Here's a work order from a big shop in Northern California that has their own roll your own software system. But again, the information there is similar. The work order items are numbered. They're all indicated as to whether they're airworthiness items or recommended items. And over on the right side, there are detailed cost estimates for labor, parts, and outside work, which is the information that an owner needs. So once the owner gets this work order at the decision point, sits down and goes over it with the shop, the owner should then come back with written instructions as to what it wants the shop to do. On this particular work order that you're looking at, you'll notice that at the left side of each item on the work order, there are two check boxes. It's probably hard to read, but one of them, the left box says approve, and the right box says decline. So that's one way that the owner can go back to the shop with specific direction, indicating which items the owner approves and which items the owner declines. Another way that we commonly use in our managed maintenance practice looks something like this. We'll send an email, and it will list the items that are approved and the items that are declined, and we can simply reference them by work order number. And as you can see in this case, this particular case, the owner has approved about 1/3 of the items and has declined about 2/3 of the items. And that's not an uncommon situation, at least in our managed maintenance practice. Here's yet another example where the where the discrepancy list was submitted in the form of an Excel spreadsheet, and we simply added a column at the right and indicated which items were declined and or deferred, and which items were approved. And in this case, we indicated for the deferred items the reason for deferring them in some cases. And in this particular case, the owner had a trip coming up, and several of these items would have prolonged the downtime of the aircraft and interfered with the owner's ability to make the trip. So he declined or deferred a number of the items simply because they were going to take too long, and decided that he was going to do them at a different time. And here's yet another example. This is a case where the shop submitted a big elaborate spreadsheet of recommended maintenance, and the owner crossed out the items that he did not want done, and sent the annotated spreadsheet back to the shop. So there's different ways of doing it, but the important thing is that the owner go through each item in the work order and give clear written direction back to the shop as to which items are being approved and which items are being declined. Now, the thing you've got to really watch out for that will torpedo this whole process, and it's something that we see happen a lot in the field, and we have to take steps to make sure it doesn't happen, at least in any of the annuals that we manage, is where the shop, instead of inspecting the aircraft first, documenting the inspection findings, going back to the owner for an approval cycle, and then performing the repairs, goes through the airplane and fixes things as they go. It's what I call inspect a little, fix a little, inspect a little, fix a little, lather, rinse, and repeat. And this is very convenient for the shop, but it's a disaster for the owner, because what it means is that there's no clear decision point in the process, and there's no clear point where the owner can get involved in the decision making and affect exactly what's done. If a shop uses this method of fixing on the fly as they're doing the inspection, then it is almost a sure thing that when the owner gets the invoice, it's going to be a big surprise. And we don't like surprises at invoice time. So you need to be careful and not allow the shop to do something like this, because again, if they do, and shops tend to do this sort of thing just because it's easy for them to do, but it deprives the owner of a clear decision point where he can get involved in the process. Maybe this would be okay in an owner-assisted annual where you were down at the shop throughout this whole process, and the IA could say, hey, look at this, do you want to fix it? But if it's not an owner-assisted annual, if you're not physically present during the process, then you've got to be really careful not to let the shop do something like this, or you basically have relinquished all control, and what the shop does is going to wind up being a big surprise that you'll find out at invoice time. So how do we prevent this from happening? Well, we just have to give the shop very clear instructions, and they would go something like this. When you put the airplane in the shop, say preferably in writing or an email or something, I'm authorizing you to open the aircraft, perform the inspection, and prepare the discrepancy list. However, do not perform any repairs or order any parts until we go over the discrepancy list together and jointly decide on a plan of action. And go on and say, please let me know as soon as you are ready for me to come in to do this. Make sure you have prepared detailed written estimates for each recommended repair, so I know what each is expected to cost and can make informed decisions about what work to approve. And if you put the shop on notice this way, and then they just start to repair stuff without um, uh, writing it up and going over it with you first, then you basically would be in a very strong position to say, look, I didn't authorize that work. I'm not going to pay for it. And if you do that a couple of times, they'll learn not to do it. But we just can't allow shops to be making repair decisions on the fly, because that basically cuts the owner out of the loop. And it's interesting that when you take your car into the shop, normally they are required to present you with a work order and get your signature on it before they can proceed. And that's a very reasonable thing. And most states have state laws that require automotive repair facilities to do that. But aircraft repair facilities aren't so constrained, and they can pretty much do anything they want. So it's really up to the owner to make sure that they handle a transaction in a business-like fashion, and one in which the owner stays in control and doesn't just give them a blank check to say, do whatever you want and charge it to my credit card, which is what we're trying to avoid. So some key takeaways from what we've talked about, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I like to see owners manage the maintenance of their aircraft in an active fashion, and not just allow the shop to make all the decisions. You should never allow any work to be done on your aircraft without your explicit written approval, just as you would have to do when your car's worked on, and never give that approval until you know exactly what work is being proposed, whether the work that's being proposed is required for the aircraft to be returned to service as airworthy, or whether it's just recommended maintenance that you could defer or decline at your discretion. And you need to know what it's going to cost and how long it will take. And if you know all those things, then you can make an informed decision as to whether you want to approve the shop doing it or whether you want to decline or defer it. For annual inspections, you need to insist on a clear decision point. In other words, that three-phase protocol where the shop inspects and prepares a work order, then you review the work order with the shop and come up with a plan of action, and then the shop proceeds to do the repairs that you have authorized in writing. The best way to go over that work order is to actually go down to the shop and have a sit-down face-to-face with the IA, work through each item of the work order with the IA, get all your questions answered, make sure you understand what was found and what is being recommended and why it's being recommended, and whether the recommendation is something that is at your discretion, or whether the IA considers that it's necessary in order to sign off the aircraft as airworthy. And they never permit the shop to get into this inspect a little, fix a little mode that we were talking about, which is something shops are very tempted to do unless you kind of lay down the law. We find this particularly in small shops, that they do this a lot unless you specifically make sure that they don't. Because if they do start fixing stuff on the fly, then they've basically cut you out of the loop. They're making the approve or decline decisions that you should be making. And then basically at the end of the process, you're going to get hit with a big surprise. And the decisions that they made may not be the decisions you would have made if you were in the process. So it's very important to avoid this, be on your guard about it, and basically putting the shop on notice up front that you're authorizing them to do the inspection, but to not go any further until you've sat down with them and gone over the discrepancy list and the recommendations and estimates is the way to prevent this from happening. And Tim, with that, why don't we just open it up for some Q&A?
Fantastic, Mike. Thank you. Let's start off with here a question from Coyle. He's wondering, in your experience, do most shops normally include routine preventive maintenance items as part of their flat rate inspection quote, such as lubing pulleys, packing wheel bearings, etc.?
Coyle, that's a really good question. There's, in my experience, there's no consistency, and when a shop quotes you a flat rate for an annual inspection, it's a really good idea to ask them specifically what's included in that flat rate, because it varies all over the map. There's no standard for it, and different shops handle it differently. Some shops include lots of routine preventive maintenance in their flat rate quotes. Other shops don't, and itemize the preventive maintenance separately on the invoice. And it's really unpredictable. So it's a really good idea when you get a flat rate quote to ask specifically what's included in that quote, and not to make any assumptions about that. I wish I could give you an answer, but there really is no industry standard, and we've seen it vary all over the map.
Okay, number of comments here people have made about owner-assisted and how important they think it is for an owner to be involved in the annual inspection through finding a shop that'll work with them doing owner-assisted annuals.
Yeah, if I were FAA administrator for a day, which isn't going to happen, I would be tempted to make a requirement that every aircraft owner go through an owner-assisted annual at least once, because it's such an important part of an education. But at the same time, realistically, I know that most owners are not interested in doing owner-assisted annuals on a routine basis. I mean, some are, but most of the owners that we deal with are not interested in doing that. And so we implement this three-phase protocol to make sure that at least they are actively participating in the decision-making process, if not, present for the inspection and the repairs. But I agree with everybody that says that the experience of going through an owner-assisted annual is really an important one. In fact, I mean, that's how I first got into the maintenance end of things. I for many years was a typical pilot and aircraft owner who was pretty much an appliance operator, and I did an owner-assisted annual and just sort of got really interested in the process, and the next thing I knew, I was doing all my own maintenance, and the rest is history. So I'm a big believer in owner-assisted annuals.
Gary's wondering, how is an owner supposed to know whether or not any one item is actually an airworthy discrepancy or something else that can legally be declined?
I mean, sometimes it's pretty obvious, but sometimes you may need help of figuring that out. And so frequently one of the things that owners will want to do during that, phase 2, where they're going over the work order and trying to decide what to do, will be to get to get an outside opinion. I do a lot of outside opinion work. The type clubs for various types of aircraft, American Bonanza Society, Cessna Pilots Association, so on and so forth, are great sources of second opinions. And most of the time you can get an expert second opinion at no cost. There are lots of people that are more than willing to help out. You just have to ask. But if it's not clear to you whether or not something is an airworthiness issue, or you suspect that it was written up as an airworthiness issue but really isn't, and there's some IAs that a little overzealous that tend to write up everything as an airworthiness issue until challenged. But the best way to deal with that, if the owner doesn't know the answer, is to get an expert opinion, again, from type clubs or advisors, people like me that do a lot of that kind of work. And it's usually very easy to get help, just for the asking, and typically it won't cost you anything.
A couple of questions here, wondering if the process that you outlined here could be something implemented for the owner of an experimental aircraft or a light sport aircraft.
Well, I mean, it really should apply to any aircraft. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's experimental or certificated. If we're not doing the maintenance ourselves and we're hiring somebody else to do it, we want to stay in control of it, and we don't want to have any big surprises when the invoice arrives. So almost everything I've said applies to experimental amateur builds and so on, or light sport aircraft. I mean, the only areas that don't apply is where I actually use the word airworthiness, because the term airworthiness only has meaning with respect to a certificated aircraft. For an uncertificated aircraft, the requirement is that it be in condition for safe operation as opposed to be airworthy. But other than the actual use of the word airworthy, pretty much everything that I'm recommending would apply to all aircraft that are being maintained by a shop or mechanic as opposed to being maintained by the owner.
And David's got a question. He's wondering, what do you think about completing the open up and inspection of the engine before starting the airframe open up and inspection? That way, if any major issues are found that might warrant engine removal or disassembly, have a decision there before going forward with the airframe. Could this reduce the total time span that the aircraft is down if the engine needs repaired or overhauled?
Actually, yes. I think most mechanics do inspect the engine first, just because, for example, things like the compression test have to be done when the engine is hot. So the very first thing that usually happens in an annual is that the engine gets run up and gets up to temperature, and then quickly the cowls are taken off and the top spark plugs come out, and the compression test is done. So I think usually the engines are inspected first as a matter of course. The approach that's being suggested here is in fact what we always do, for instance, when we're doing a pre-buy, because the firewall forward part of the aircraft is usually where the biggest ticket discrepancies can be found with the smallest amount of disassembly, if you will. So for things like pre-buys, it makes it compelling sense to do the engine inspection first, because if you find some deal breaker in the engine compartment, you're probably not going to go any further. In the case of an annual, once you start it, you're sort of obligated to finish it. So you're always going to be inspecting the airplane, the airframe in an annual, even if some big deal is found wrong with the engine. But I think the questioner is correct that that inspecting the engine first to find any problems with it before getting into the airframe inspection probably is a sensible thing to do. And I think that's really the way most shops do it, simply because of the things I was talking about, that the engine inspection starts out with stuff that has to be done while the engine, or should at least be done when the engine is still hot.
David's wondering, he said, sometimes normal annual maintenance on a low time plane can do more damage than good. For example, removing and repacking wheel bearings every year. But if the plane only flies 50 to 70 hours a year, it seems unnecessary. What do you suggest?
Well, I mean, first of all, the repacking the wheel bearings is preventive maintenance, and it's not required to be done at an annual. And if the owner feels that it's superfluous, he can just instruct the shop not to do it. Whether or not wheel bearings should be repacked every year, it depends a lot on the circumstances of where the aircraft lives and so on. If an airplane that lives out of doors, and particularly in a humid climate, I personally think that repacking the wheel bearings annually is an important thing to do. If the airplane is based in Tucson, or if it lives in a hangar, then you could make the case that you could go longer. I remember there was a period of 6 years, I think, when I used to fly down to the Cayman Islands. There was a big aviation conference down there that I was invited to speak at, and my plane would sit outside down in the Caymans, for a week. And of course, there was always rain every day, and it's a super humid environment. And I invariably had wheel bearing problems every year. When I stopped going to the Caymans, I stopped having the wheel bearing problems, because my airplane mostly lives in a hangar and stays dry. So it really depends a lot on the environment as to how often that stuff should be done. But the preventive maintenance is not something that has to be done at every annual, and it's something that is negotiable with the IA. There are other things that probably that you could make a valid argument don't need to be done every year, but that are simply required because for small aircraft of the kind that most of us fly, the FAA really doesn't approve phased inspections the way it would for a biz jet or an air carrier, where there are some things are inspected every 6 months and some things don't have to be inspected except every 5 years. Unfortunately, for small airplanes, we're required to do annual inspections, and that basically means that everything in the aircraft is supposed to be inspected every year. And that is certainly not the optimal way to do things. There are things in the airplane that really ought to be inspected a lot more often than once a year, and other things that could easily go 2 or 3 years between inspections. But for small aircraft that are subject to the annual inspection requirement. The FAA doesn't give us that flexibility, and that's true of experimentals as well, because we're required to do an annual condition inspection on those aircraft.
Good segue into another question David asked, but he's just kind of wondering what's that regulation that outlines the preventive maintenance that an owner can do on their aircraft without having an A&P or IA sign it off?
It's in Part 43. It's actually Part 43, Appendix A sub C, and you can pull it up on various websites, including the FAA website, and it lists about that appendix to Part 43 lists about 36 specific tasks that the FAA deems to be preventive maintenance that a pilot-rated owner is allowed to perform on his own aircraft without any involvement of an A&P. And of those 36 items, about 24 of them apply to airplanes, and the remaining dozen apply to things like helicopters and hot air balloons and other sorts of aircraft. So for airplanes, there are about 24 items that owners are specifically allowed to do on their own recognizance in Part 43, Appendix A.
That would seem like maybe a good webinar subject. Have we ever done one on the owner preventive maintenance tasks?
I'll have to check. You may be right, but possibly we haven't, in which case it's probably one we ought to put on the calendar.
Yeah, I think that would be a good one. Question here from Brian. He's just wondering, when providing the initial owner stance in writing, do shops typically sign it? I think he's maybe talking the discrepancy list there. Corby also asked, large detailed discrepancy lists take a lot of time to prepare. How do shops bill this?
Okay, well, two questions there. The first question, I think you may have misinterpreted it. The way I read the question had to do with not the work order, but the initial statement to the shop that I was recommending that said you are authorized to proceed with the inspection, and then write it all up and then stop until we get together to discuss the work order.
Right. And maybe he's wondering if shops typically sign that then also to acknowledge, probably.
Normally just sending them an email to that effect is sufficient. If you have it in writing, and then the shop winds up doing stuff without your approval, you're in a pretty strong position, because you specifically, not only didn't you authorize it, but you specifically told them not to go ahead beyond the inspection part of the inspection. So, asking the shop to sign it, I suppose you could make an argument for it, but it seems a little bit paranoid to me, and not trying to start off the relationship with the shop any more antagonistically than need be. It's just a statement that says, look, I want to be involved in the decision making here, so here's how I'm asking you to do it. And it's, like I said, it's basically the same ground rules as everybody is used to when it comes to maintaining their car, because it's normally a matter of state law that has to happen. But there aren't any regulations or laws that affect aircraft maintenance shops, so the owner has to set the ground rules. Let's see, the second question had to do with writing up the work order
lists. Yeah,
and frankly, there really isn't any extra cost involved in doing that, because first of all, the discrepancy list has to be written up as a matter of regulation, and second of all, the cost information, which is really the time-consuming stuff that's working out the labor costs and looking up the cost of parts and all that kind of stuff are things that would have to happen at invoice time anyway in order to prepare the invoice. So we're simply saying we don't want you to wait till invoice time to look up what the cost of the parts are. We want you to look it up at the decision point so that the owner knows what he's approving and what it's going to cost, and isn't being asked to give the shop carte blanche to do something that that is inordinately expensive and so on. So it really isn't asking the shop to do any extra work. It's just perhaps changing the timing of that work to do it earlier rather than at the very end. If they do it at the very end, then it's too late to allow the owner to affect the outcome. If it's done at the decision point, then the owner is involved in the decision making and can say what he wants done, what he doesn't want done. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great. A couple of questions here about.
And I mean, if you notice that work order that I had up on the screen, the descriptions of the discrepancies and the recommended repairs weren't particularly long-winded. They were typically pretty short and crisp. The most time-consuming part, as I said, is looking up the cost of everything, specifically the cost of parts and of outside work. Outside work is where the shop has to send something out to a specialist, like a prop shop or whatever, that's going to bill for its time to the shop, and then the shop has to turn around and bill the owner. And looking up those costs of parts and outside work is the really time-consuming part, but it's something that has to be done anyway. So we're just asking him to do it early rather than late.
Great. A couple questions here about manufacturers' service bulletins, and how should a person determine if service bulletin should be approved or deferred?
Again, unless it's obvious to you, getting a second opinion is, for example, from a type club is really the best way to do it. The shop that's doing the work is basically compelled to recommend complying with all manufacturer service bulletins, because if the shop recommended that you don't comply with the manufacturer service bulletin and then you wind up having an accident, you can bet that the plaintiff lawyer would use that recommendation against the shop in a lawsuit. So that's one of the problems that we have with maintenance, is that you can't get the basic structure of things, and particularly the litigious nature of aviation, makes it very difficult to get really objective advice from the shop that's doing the work, on things like that, simply because the shop can't recommend non-compliance with the manufacturer's recommendation without opening themselves up to liability. So the best way to deal with something like that is to get a second opinion. And as I said, of course, our managed maintenance clients, we provide them with those second opinions, but type clubs are a great place to go for that sort of input. And normally, type club costs $50 a year to join typically, and it's probably the best $50 you could ever spend on your airplane, because it gives you access to a lot of expertise that you wouldn't have access to otherwise.
David's wondering, do you think it's a good idea to have an ANPIA member of a large flying club do the annual and maintenance rather than taking the work to an independent shop?
Well, I'm not sure the exact context. A lot of flying clubs that are big enough will have their own mechanics on staff to to maintain their airplanes. And if you can do that, if the club is big enough to support that, it tends to be much more cost effective than sending it out to an outside shop. But flying clubs come in all shapes and sizes, and small ones typically, where they only have a couple airplanes, can't really justify hiring their own IA on staff. Big ones, it makes all the sense in the world for them to do that.
Richard's wondering, on the 337 form, what is considered an appliance?
Oh, that's very simple. The FAA divides every part of an aircraft, every component that is either a part of the aircraft or is sort of structurally attached to the aircraft, to fall into one of four categories. It's either an engine part, an airframe part, a propeller, or if it's not one of those three things, then it's an appliance. So appliance is just kind of the catch-all category for anything that isn't an engine part, an airframe part, or a propeller. So, for example, radios are appliances. Instruments are appliances. The alternator on your aircraft is normally considered an appliance, but the magneto is not considered an appliance. It's considered an engine part, and the reason is the engine won't run without the magneto. It's an essential part of the engine. It's as important as, say, the pistons, but the engine will run just dandy without the alternator. The alternator is just something that is hitching a ride on the engine and stealing a little power from it. So alternators would normally be considered appliances, but magnetos would be considered engine parts because they're a required component of the engine. So that's basically the answer. The appliance is a catch-all category, and anything that is not considered airframe, engine, or propeller falls into the category of appliance.
Great. Fran is wondering, she says, I know of a Super Cub glider towplane that had an automotive rearview mirror mounted on the right strut. The IA refused to sign it off until it was removed. What would be the proper action for the owner in this case?
Well, I mean, the proper action, and it's funny, I'm just writing an article on this for Sport Aviation that will appear in a couple months on what are called alterations, and mounting the rearview mirror on the aircraft is clearly an alteration, and the rules for alterations are that, and this is, of course, the Super Cub is a certificated aircraft. The rules for alterations are that the mechanic that installs the alteration is responsible for making a determination as to whether that alteration is what's called a major alteration or a minor alteration. And the term major alteration is defined in FAR 1.1 in the definition section of the FARs, and Part 43, Appendix A, includes a long list of items that the FAA considers to be major alterations. So it's provided as a bunch of examples to help mechanics decide whether an alteration is major or minor. And the basic rules for alterations is that if the alteration is minor, then 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 an A&P has the authority to sign it off, and the only documentation that's required is a logbook. It's just a simple 43-9 logbook entry. But if the alteration is considered to be a major alteration, and again, the FAA provides mechanics guidance in the form of both FAR 1.1 and Part 43 Appendix A as to what the FAA considers to be major. A major alteration is by definition above a mechanic's pay grade to approve, and so it requires either what's called FAA approved data, which is usually something like an STC that has an FAA signature on it, or requires getting a field approval where you have to go to the FSDO and get a FSDO inspector to sign off on it. So major alterations basically have to have an FAA approval to do, and then they have to have an IA inspect the work to make sure it's okay. And minor alterations require neither. They can be done by any A&P mechanic, and they are just signed off with a simple logbook entry. So the question would then be, does this rear view mirror hung on the strut constitute a major alteration or not? And it probably doesn't appreciably affect the weight and balance of the aircraft. So the real threshold question is whether it affects the aerodynamics in an appreciable way. And the installing mechanic, whoever it is that put that mirror on, should have made that determination. And if his determination was that it did not have an appreciable aerodynamic effect on the aircraft, then he was within his rights to sign it off as a minor alteration, and the IA should not have questioned it. If, on the other hand, that rearview mirror has an appreciable effect on the aerodynamics of the aircraft, then the IA would have been correct, except that he should not have refused to sign off the annual. What he should have done is offered to help the owner get a field approval for it, which is the proper way of dealing with non-standard major alterations that are in STC. So for the IA to simply refuse to sign off the annual, it sounds like he's not a very cooperative IA, because if I was presented with that situation and I felt that it was a major alteration based on the FAA guidance, then I would tell the owner that if he wants to keep the mirror there, we really need to go to the FSDO and see if we can get a field approval for it. Does that answer the question? I hope.
I think it did, yeah. Keeping in tune with that, we got another one here from Coyle. He said, if the owner and IA cannot agree on the degree of work needed to clear a specific airworthy discrepancy, and the IA agrees to sign off the inspection with an open item, is it legal to fly the aircraft to a different shop to complete the work to the owner's standards? And would a ferry permit be required?
Yeah, if an annual is signed off with one or more discrepancies, which means that it's being signed off as unairworthy with a specific list of unairworthy items being given to the aircraft owner, then in order to fly the aircraft somewhere else to have those discrepancies cleared, a ferry permit is required. It's usually very easy to get the ferry permits. Typically, you just fill out a form and submit it to the FSDO, and answer a couple of questions over the phone, and they fax you back a ferry permit. But if the issue is such that the FAA hesitates to issue a ferry permit, then typically the way we deal with that is to convince some other mechanic to, get in his pickup truck and drive to where the airplane is and clear the discrepancies that way. And anytime there's an issue like this, you always weigh the two possibilities of getting the ferry permit to move the airplane to the mechanic, or avoiding the ferry permit and moving the mechanic to the aircraft. And depending on what's involved, it may turn out that one of those two is easier and more cost effective than the other. So I think that's really the answer to the question. But the answer to the question as it was posed is yes, you would have to get a ferry permit to move the aircraft if the annual was signed off with one or more discrepancies. But unless those discrepancies are really serious sounding, it's usually very easy to get a ferry permit.
And we just got done doing a webinar on ferry permits.
Yes.
Was it last month or the month before? Yeah.
So I think it was probably the month before. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So we can check back in the webinars archive for that wire webinar on ferry permits. Question here from Brian. How can an owner better prepare logbooks for inspection at a new shop? Could they add a spreadsheet with key points? It's hard for many to read written entries, he says.
Yeah, well, first of all, I couldn't agree more. I just hate to see handwritten logbook entries. I mean, in this day and age when every human being has several computers, the idea of handwriting logbook entries just strikes me as being very unprofessional. And for the aircraft we manage, we never let mechanics write anything in the logbooks. We always require that they prepare their logbook entries on self-adhesive stickers so that we can review the logbook entries for accuracy and suitability. And if we don't like the way the logbook entry was made, we send it back and ask them to do it over again. If they write directly in a logbook, you can't do that. So we never allow mechanics to write in any of our clients' logbooks, and we require that their maintenance record entries always be done on self-adhesive stickers. The majority of the shops that we work with, as I said, use a decent computerized work order management system, and those typically include printing out nice, legible, computer-printed logbook entries. We still run into some graybeard small shops that still write logbook entries by hand, but they tend to be rather illegible and hard to deal with. The most important thing that owners need to make sure that they have is an up-to-date airworthiness directive compliance summary. Which is basically a single page or a couple of pages, usually done in the form of a spreadsheet or something, that lists all applicable airworthiness directives and describes how and when they were complied with, and has a signature, so that an IA, when he's doing his due diligence during an inspection, has all of the AD compliance information in one place and can just read through it and doesn't have to go digging through, dozens and dozens of pages of difficult to read logbook entries to try to figure out whether a particular AD has been complied with or not. That's probably the single most important thing that you can do. I personally like and use a system called ADLOG, A-D-L-O-G. You can look it up on the web at adlog.com, and that basically organizes the maintenance records in a loose leaf binder with tabs and everything in a very convenient way, and includes a subscription service where every applicable AD is printed out and mailed to the owner in a 3-ring punched format to go into this notebook, and once a year an AD compliance summary page is mailed to the owner to go into the book to ensure that everything is as well organized as possible, and that all of the necessary AD information that an IA might have to look at to research the AD compliance is all in one place. It's a really cool system. It's quite reasonably priced. I forget there's an initial fee to get the system, and then there's an annual subscription fee to keep getting the updates. But it's very reasonable, and most IAs that I know absolutely love it. I've been using it for my own airplane for years and years. And again, it's called ADLOG, adlog.com.
Richard's wondering, do you consider researching on FAA.gov acceptable for AD review?
Sure.
Checking ADs?
Absolutely.
Sure. Okay, good. Question then from Joseph. He says, how risky is it to take possession of an airplane at the completion of its annual, but the stickers for log entry aren't available for a few days?
One of my hot buttons, and I know I've covered this in a couple of past webinars, but this is absolutely one of the things that drives me crazy. It is absolutely a violation of the regulations to fly an aircraft after any maintenance, but especially after an annual, without a signed logbook entry approving the aircraft for return to service having been made. And interestingly enough, although the FARs require mechanics to make accurate logbook entries, maintenance record entries, and specify in some detail what is to be in those entries, and in fact make it a major violation punishable by very severe penalties to falsify maintenance record entries. What the FARs do not do is impose any kind of a timeliness requirement on mechanics. So if a mechanic works on your aircraft or even does an annual inspection of your aircraft and doesn't get around to doing the logbook entries and signing them off for, a month and a half, he is not violating any regulation. But if you fly the airplane, you are instantly violating a regulation, because you're not allowed to fly the airplane without the maintenance record entry having been made and signed. So, what I have strongly urged owners is never, ever accept an IOU for maintenance record entry. Having the airplane in your physical possession is worthless without a signed logbook entry, because you cannot fly the airplane legally. Now, it happens all the time. It happens every day. Most of the time, there are no adverse consequences. But, just wait until, you get the airplane back from an annual and something goes wrong with it. And maybe you do something that gets the FAA's attention, like making a gear-up landing or something. I mean, the most likely time for an airplane to suffer a mechanical failure is right after maintenance, of course. And should that happen, and should something happen where some incident occur where the FAA looks into it, the very first thing they're going to want to see is the signed maintenance record entry. And if they find out that it hasn't been done, it's the owner who's in hot water, or actually the pilot who's in hot water, not the mechanic. And it's funny. We just had I don't know if you noticed, but we just had a lawsuit that was written up in AvWeb a week or two ago, where a GA mechanic had a $13 million verdict rendered against him. It's a symbolic verdict because the mechanic didn't have, 2 pennies to rub together, so the plaintiff's never going to recover any money from it. But basically, there was a fatal crash of an aircraft that this mechanic had just annualed, and the owner picked it up and flew it and crashed. The mechanic had not yet signed off a logbook entry, and the cause of the crash turned out to be that the mechanic had done an improper repair to the seats, to the pilot seat, and the seat slipped back, and the pilot couldn't reach the controls, and the airplane crashed, and he was killed. And the mechanic took the position that he never inspected the aircraft because he never signed a logbook entry, and when he heard the aircraft crashed, he certainly didn't want to admit to ever having even seen the damn thing. And then it turned out in litigation that the decedent's computer had a bunch of emails from the mechanic where the mechanic clearly stated that he had completed the inspection, the airplane was ready to pick up. And so the mechanic's testimony was contradicted by the mechanic's own emails, and the jury decided that he wasn't telling the truth and took him to the cleaners. But the pilot made a critical error there by flying the aircraft without seeing a signed logbook entry. And in fact, one of my pet peeves is, for this very reason, is that a lot of owners leave their maintenance logs at the shop. And if you leave your maintenance logs at the shop, then you really have no way of verifying that the maintenance records have been made and signed off properly. And the FARs clearly require that owners verify that the logbook entries have been made and signed off before flying the aircraft. So unless you have those maintenance record entries in your hot little hand, there's no way that you can possibly verify them. And it's a huge problem, and we run into it all the time because shops are constantly, this happens every Friday. The airplane owners always want their airplanes on Friday because they've got some big weekend plan, and so every Friday at a maintenance shop is a literal orgy of buttoning up airplanes to get them out the door, with owners sitting there tapping their feet. And they typically say, well, the airplane's ready, and but we haven't had time to do the logbook entries. We'll get them to you next week. And that's just a huge trap for aircraft owners because it's basically urging them to violate the FARs. And most owners don't understand that they're violating the FARs. They don't understand that the mechanics are allowed to take all the time they want to come up with those maintenance record entries. But it's the owner's responsibility not to fly the airplane until the maintenance record entries have been made. it's a big trap for aircraft owners.
Well, some really good points there you just wrapped up with. We're about at the end here. We're actually at the end, but let's just get in one more. I think this is a good question. Gustavo is wondering, I made interior upgrades some time ago with some approved materials, but did not log the upgrades. Can I still make entries into my logbook even though they're out of date sequence?
Yes, and you should do that. You should make the entries. All maintenance work needs to be logged. Replacing interior furnishings is on the list of preventive maintenance items, so it's something that an owner is allowed to do on his own recognizance without getting a mechanic involved. But all maintenance, regardless of whether it's done by a mechanic or an owner, or even an uncertificated individual, must always be logged. And absolutely, if there is no maintenance record entry for it, you should make one, dated as of the date that the work was done. Don't worry about it being out of sequence. The sequence of things in the logbook really has no significance. In fact, the FAA doesn't even require that you keep logbooks. Maintenance record entries would be just as legal if they were on 3x5 cards. They don't have to be bound. There's the only thing that matters from a regulatory standpoint is that they exist. The FAA doesn't care what form they exist in, whether they're printed or whether they're on a CD or written on a roll of toilet paper. And the FAA doesn't care what sequence they're written in, as long as they contain the required information that from the regs 43.9 and 43.11, which define what information is required in logbook entry. So the answer is definitely make the logbook entry, and don't worry about the fact that it's out of sequence.
Fantastic. Mike, great webinar. Thank you so much. Please, if you'd care to make closing comments to the attendees.
Okay. Well, just first of all, let me just mention what I always mention, which is anybody who had a question or comes up with a question that wasn't answered during this Q&A session, my email address is on the screen right now, and feel free to drop me an email. I always try to respond to any questions that come in by email. So if you didn't get your question answered, do not give up hope. Just the next 3 webinars that we've got scheduled. I do these maintenance webinars on the first Wednesday of every month, and the next one is May 6th on the issue of when making a decision that an engine needs to be torn down. One of the most costly decisions that we can make, and so we never want to tear down an engine unnecessarily. So we'll talk about how we go through the decision-making process of whether an engine actually has to be torn down or not. The June webinar is titled Safe versus Airworthy, and it gets into really what the word airworthy means, and we often use airworthy and safe as if they were synonyms, but they're really not synonyms. And an aircraft may be safe but unairworthy, or it may be airworthy but unsafe. And so we'll get into the specific definition of what those words mean, and really what makes up airworthiness. And finally, the July webinar will be talking about warranties and what they're good for and why they aren't all they're cracked up to be, and just generally talk about the whole issue of warranties, and particularly engine warranties, which are usually a pretty big deal. And finally, I send out an electronic newsletter, usually about the middle of every month. It's free. It talks about lots of interesting maintenance things. And if you're interested in signing up for it, there's a checkbox on the survey that Tim is going to put up at the end of the webinar, or you can go online anytime at savvyaviator.com and add yourself to the mailing list. Every issue has an unsubscribe link, so if you sign up for it and decide that it was a terrible mistake, it's very easy to get yourself back off the list. And finally, would encourage you, if you haven't seen it already, to check out my my book entitled Manifesto on Amazon.com. If you search for Mike Bush Manifesto on Amazon, it'll take you right to it. It's a pretty interesting book, and I think that most of the people who attend these webinars would benefit from the book. Amazon sells it for some insanely low price, like $12 or something. So at any rate, that's all I have, Tim, and we'll see everybody next month.
Thank you, Mike. Great webinar as always. A lot of nice comments come in through the control panel here, thanking you for tonight's presentation. Another excellent presentation by Mike. Thank you so much. And a couple people even said that they really appreciate the manifesto book, and wondering when number 2 is going to be coming.
Well, my objective was that number 2 would be ready in time for AirVenture 2015. As many of you know, I had a little. I was out of service for a while because my wife passed away in December, and so I'm not real confident that we're going to make that deadline at this point. But if it's not ready for AirVenture 2015, it'll be ready shortly thereafter. We'll do our best.
Great. Well, definitely understandable. On behalf of your webinars community that gets so much out of what you give to us during these webinars, I'll express on behalf of all the attendees our deepest sympathy on your loss, Mike.
Thank you, Tim.
To all the attendees, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Have a great night, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.